So we can think about workers moving from one area to another as sort of a form of investment in the sense that it is initially costly and the payoff or the benefit comes later after all these costs have been incurred. So some of the costs of moving are the familiar cost of leaving behind friends and family, the monetary cost of actually moving, the effort it takes to actually find a new job, right? The standard costs that we sort of talked about earlier in the semester. In the case of immigration, there are new costs that must be considered. And the most obvious one here would be the cost of getting to the new country. Now, in some cases, this entails, a long process to apply for a work visa or permit or some type of official document granting permission to work in the new country. Right? In a few instances, you not only need the approval of the country you want to emigrate to, right? But you also need the approval of the country that you want to leave or emigrate from. And so these costs can be significant, not just in terms of money, but also in terms of the time or how long it takes to actually go through these things, right? But these costs can be entirely ignored if you decide to enter the new country illegally, right? Though choosing to do that entails costs of another nature, including the cost of potentially being stopped or arrested at the border by officers of either country, detained, stuff like that. Okay, so cost side, we've got the familiar ones, getting there, finding a job, leaving your friends, right? Oh, should spell friends right. There we go. All right. Okay, so we've got those costs that we're familiar with, but also just how do you enter the new country? All right. Work visas. Or should you do it illegally? Right, so these two would be the legal way, right? Or you can do it illegally, okay? On the benefits side, right, we have, sort of a whole stream of benefits. We have to take into consideration the fact that the person who emigrates will be benefiting, presumably, for the rest of their lives, right? And so what we can do is we can say, in year one, you get an extra, let's say 10 grand. All right, year two, you get an extra 10 grand. Year three, plus 10 grand, right? And so on and so forth. We can all the way go up to year N, and you get another 10 grand, right? And if we wanted to find, the total benefit of this, we'd have to take, the net present value of this entire stream and bring it over to here, right? And that would be sort of how we do that, right? And I'm going to assume that you've taken a finance class or some other class or an algebra class that has taught you how to do net present value. So I'm not going to test you on how to do that. Just keep in mind that the benefits of emigrating are not just, just this, right? It's all of these, right? All the extra benefits that you get for the entirety of your duration in that country, right? So it's not just like a one-shot gain. It's a gain over the entire life. And so we can express, so how do we decide whether to emigrate or not? And if we decide to emigrate, how would we ever, come up with whether or not we should do it legally or illegally, right? Most people would say, oh, well, of course you should do it, legally. And yet, every day we hear about people coming into countries illegally. So let's sort of build a model of how we could describe that. And so what we're going to do is we're going to develop sort of what could be called a decision tree. All right? So we're going to develop a decision tree, and we're just going to illustrate the decision to emigrate. Okay, so we'll start here. All right, at the start, you are you're in your country. and you have to choose whether or not to emigrate. Okay, so if you decide to stay, right, you would come down to that box, and if you decide to emigrate, you would come to this box. Okay, and so if you decide to emigrate, then you have a second decision that you have to make. All right, and that one would be to do so legally or illegally. And each one of these is going to entail different costs and different benefits. Okay, and so let me just throw up the algebra that I put in the notes, and then we'll go through explaining it. So we got C1 minus B, B minus the quantity C1 plus C2, and B minus the quantity C1 plus C3. Okay, so to solve this tree, to figure out what you should do, all right? And by the way, you can make these trees for all decisions in your life and sort of frame them in this manner, right? If you want, it turns out doing so is a pretty beneficial or pretty easy way to see decisions that you have to make. Okay, so to solve this tree, we're going to use what's called backwards induction. Okay, and so let's sort of go through what these symbols mean. Okay, so we're going to start off by calling B the net present value of moving. Right? So this is all of this stuff here, right? I'm just calling that B. Okay, so those are B for benefits. Okay, and we're going to say that C1 is equal to the cost of moving right, which is like the money cost of moving yourself and your family, as well as the cost of leaving your friends, family, and culture behind. So these are, C1 would be like the cost of moving from Michigan to Toledo, right? Where you don't have to do any additional paperwork, there's nothing that you have to do, you just have to get there, basically, right? So C1 is the cost of moving. You can also think of it as like just the cost of getting there. And let's call C2, right? We're going to call C2 the additional cost of doing, the visa paperwork, for example, right? This is like the additional cost of all the necessary paperwork to move legally, right? So a person in Mexico, if they want to come to the U.S., it's going to have to get a work permit or a work visa or a green card of some sort. This will be the cost of getting one of those, right? And then we'll call C3 will be the cost of the additional cost, I should say, of moving illegally. Okay, and so these are the three relevant costs. So you have the cost of just moving, of just getting to where you want to go. If you want to do it legally, C2 would be the increase in cost of doing the paperwork. And if you want to do it illegally, you have the additional costs associated with moving across the border, illegally. So you might have to, hire a coyote to bring you across. You have to live in some sort of fear of constantly being discovered, all kinds of stuff. And so let's sort of go through this game step by step. And we'll just sort of, illustrate a few things here. So let's start off by assuming that B is less than C1. Okay? So if the benefits of moving are less than just the physical costs of moving, right, then we say that the person will stay, right? And we know this it makes intuitive sense. If the benefit of moving is smaller than the cost of moving, you're not going to bother doing it, right? And so we know that you're going to stay unless the benefits are larger than at least C1, right? Because even if the cost of moving here legally or illegally were 0, you still wouldn't want to move because you're better off staying in your country, okay? So this tree becomes far more interesting if we consider B is greater than C1, right? In this case, we're actually uncertain, right? Because it depends on C2 and C3, okay? So let's sort of go through how we sort of think about this. And so what we want, or what the person wants to do, is they want to maximize their utility, right? We want to maximize their overall happiness. And so here, what you would do is you would plug in values for B, C1, C2, and C3, and whichever one yielded you the biggest number would be the one that you would want to choose. Okay, so let's say that B is less than C1, right? So this number will be positive, right? So let me break out a red pen. So if we're here, right? If we're here, then this number will be positive, right? Because we've got the bigger number minus the smaller number, so it'll leave a positive number. If we will go to this one, we'll have a negative square, or a negative number value, right? And so here, right, because we have the small one minus the big one, that'll give us a negative number, and again, a negative number here, right? And so here, the person's highest utility gain is here, right? Staying in their country, okay? And if B is greater than C1, well, we know that this will be negative, right? Because if they stay here, we have a small number minus a big number, okay? So this will be negative. But this one's uncertain because it could be the case that even though B is bigger than C1, this C2 term might make this whole function even more negative than this, right? And the same can be said about C3. If C3 is sufficiently large, then even though the benefit of moving exceeds the physical cost of moving, or the cost of physically moving, I should say, right? The illegality of it might be so severe that this would be sufficiently negative to make this other negative number bigger. So it could still be the case that even if the benefit of moving is greater than the physical cost of moving, people might still stay. Okay? And so what we're getting at here is sort of a framework of thinking about whether or not someone will decide to stay or to immigrate legally or immigrate illegally. Okay?